Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us here for this conversation about ageing, and particularly about normalising conversations themselves about ageing and how we can help people really make better and more informed decisions in later life. It would be quite easy to think this is, perhaps ill-timed given all the things that are happening and the way that this pandemic is affecting particularly older people and targeting quite ruthlessly the older generations. But actually it feels more pertinent than ever that we address this topic. We already have, really around the world, and certainly in the UK and more developed countries, ageing populations, and increasingly the challenges that brings, the great things it brings about people living longer, but also the challenges it brings and how we can better cater for people in later life and help them. So I'm joined today on the panel by, I'll go through them briefly, Mervyn Eastman, Mervyn has worked in social care for over 40 years, I'm told. Director of Social Services for a period, and on retirement became Director of Better Government for Older People, I think working with the Cabinet Office and DWP, and hosts, amongst other things, a weekly radio show called Age Speaks. So it's very well versed on the kind of issues that we will talk about today. Thanks for joining us, Mervyn. We also are joined by Mary Bright, who is the Specialist Advisor on Age to the Chief Executive of the Phoenix Partnership, or Phoenix Group, sorry. Over 20 years in financial services, and most recently the role looks at how business approaches an ageing society and how it helps people in an ageing society, how finance works. In 2018, Mary was appointed Specialist Advisor to the Women and Equalities Select Committee as well, so has not just business but political experience, I would suggest, in that regard. And finally with me today, Jacqueline, or should I call you Jackie? Jackie Marshall-Cyrus. Individual living and health ageing specialist. I'm told more recently though, Director of Jackie Marshall-Cyrus and Associates Limited, a boutique firm that's helping companies advising on ageing issues and how they approach them. Also a practicing nurse specialist in gerontology, and a former lead specialist at Innovate UK's assisted living innovation platform. So again, plenty of experience. Thanks very much, Jackie, for joining us. For my part, I spent most of my career, over 30 years, with Standard Life, much of that time working on pensions and retirement. So I've spent decades talking to people about retirement and about these issues, perhaps similar to Mary, currently from a business point of view. So I'll chip in as necessary, but my three panelists, I'm sure, will provide plenty to go on. So let's kick off with a fairly open question. Maybe I'll start with you, Mervyn, if that's okay. So, people don't generally want to consider themselves as ageing or aged or old. We used to talk about pensioners and have a very broad description of an older group of people. Why don't people want to consider themselves ageing? Is it really obvious, or is there a bit more nuance than that? Tell me.
Well, I think I'd prefix my response by pointing out that, in my view, people not wanting to age is not a phenomena of the 20th or 21st century. If you go back to the 1800s, there was an issue when status was defined in terms of one's wealth, not in terms of one's chronological age. There then became a move in terms of understanding middle age. And that's where we begin to see the germs of this, what I would call this fear that relates to deficit, dependency, and sickness. And a sense that I do not want to grow old, because old means that I'm going to be without. It's about loss, it's about dependency. And I suppose in terms of looking at today's position, why people don't want to become old. It's particularly interesting in terms of the 1945-64 baby boomer cohorts. And I say cohorts because it's not just one 20-year group, but made up of 2 or 3 different types of sub-generations. And it's often seen that the boomer doesn't want to be old because they're grasping on and do not want to lose their youth. Now, I think that's a very interesting development. But to answer your question so that everyone gets a chance to actually say something, for me, the key issues are around the consequences of othering a generation or a demographic, to think of them as not us, but somebody else. I think there's issues around age apartheid, where our responses to ageing, certainly in terms of the social care field, is really around separation and segregation. We segregate older people, mainly because of chronological age, but because we feel that they're somebody else. Secondly, I think that there's the commodification of older people, older adults. We are commodified. And one illustration I'd used for that was the horrendous John Lewis Age UK Christmas advert. I think it was 2015, of the man on the moon. Now that, for me, was a pure example of how we have normalised the commodification of older people. And I think, lastly, there are the issues around youthful imaging. That youthful images are what is seen as appropriate, rather than older adults, whatever their chronological age. I think that's why there's a consequence to those factors that mean we don't want to grow old. We become somebody else. Okay. That makes sense.
It does make sense. Very interesting. You raise a number of interesting points, and you touched on social care, which opens a whole 2 or 3 hours worth of conversation right there. So no, absolutely, it does make a lot of sense. And I just at a personal level, very briefly, I couldn't agree more on the point about baby boomers. We do homogenize that group of people as if they're all wealthy with no problems, and that's just not true at all, including many of my friends, my older friends, who are baby boomers and actually really struggling in later life. They weren't one of the lucky ones. Thanks very much, Mervyn. Jackie, can I come to you next? Any thoughts? Why do people not want to consider themselves aging?
I think what it flagged up for me was the whole question about, under which we're discussing this, about normalizing the conversations about aging. I think it's less about normalizing. I think there needs to be a real overhaul in how we talk about aging, what we understand it to be, and how we approach it from a commercial point of view, from an economic point of view, a social point of view, and also, a healthcare point of view. There seems to be population, a segment of our population, people will say 60 plus, some people say 65 plus, some people say 70 plus, it's relative, are seen as aging. Yeah, and however you want to categorize or classify aging, because there are different categories and classifications around aging. People classify it differently. Some people see it as significantly as a biological process. Some people see that there's social parts, components to it. Some people see it as environmental parts, aspects to it. It involves all of those. But if we were to look at the definition of aging generally, which says that it's an accumulation of changes in the human being over time, and these changes also include physical, psychological, and social changes, then it is not a phenomenon particular to one group of people. From the moment you are conceived, you begin to age. From the moment you are deemed a human being, you are subject to the social construct that we have put around aging. You'll be given a number in terms of time, the time that you exist. Yeah, that number changes when you are born, and that then the clock starts ticking for you, and you fit into that social construct. So I think we need to be very clear when we're talking about aging, that there are various components involved in this. And in different fields, people focus on different things. In this discussion, I suspect we're very much going to focus on the social dynamics around aging and the economic impact or influence of this discussion. For me, I think there needs to be consideration that when we ask the question, why don't people want to consider themselves as aging? I'll echo Mervyn's theme. I think we need to be careful that we don't subscribe to the social construct of social distancing, where we see ourselves as a group, a separate group of people, talking about another group of people and subtracting ourselves from that group of people. We are all part and parcel. Every single one of this on this panel is part of the population that will be impacted in later, and even impacting on us now, the whole aging agenda. Yeah. So I think it's about seeing ourselves as part of this movement. And, when you talk about the generation gap, our language and everything consolidates that. When the gap, there's no gap. We are all part of a population. For research purposes or whatever, we are segmented, but we are all heading in the same direction. And I think growing older, there's a social construct of old age, varies by societies. Yes, it's a social construct in itself, which means it's a concept that we have created, and we have given that concept symbols, values, and meaning. For the most part, those symbols, values, and meaning are not positive. For the most part, we need to have an overhaul. We need at a social level, at a governmental level, at an industry level, academic level, we need to turn that on its head. So as Mervyn said, there are associations with it. There are associations of, there's a word called gerascophobia, which implies a clinical phobia about growing older and not being able to do what you want to do, not having the resources to do it, and being incapable of doing things for yourself by virtue of some age-related condition. So it's about fear, it's about loss. I think it's about fear of institutionalization at the end of the road. It's about fear of losing the ability to express your sexuality, to seek love and intimacy. It's about society in some ways taking away permission from you and diminishing your personhood. So I think this is a much deeper issue that we need to address, and less about people not wanting to consider themselves as aging.
Okay, that's very interesting. And you pick up on this point around there are so many negative sort of images is the wrong word, but there's so many negative connotations that we create, we construct about aging. And certainly in my experience, we can't tackle that from the financial services point of view just by having nice photos of older people on a beach when they retire. I think we learned quite quickly that wasn't a catch-all. But no, absolutely, it's some really, really interesting issues there, and some quite deep and wide issues there as well. Mary, we'll give you a chance to say a few words. I'm really interested to think what you have to say about all this, given you will no doubt have experience of what many customers, aged customers, if I call them that, older customers, are facing and the challenges they've got.
So I think the question that we're looking at is why and then how. So if I start with the why and take a financial view of that, when the old age pension was introduced in the UK, your life expectancy when it was introduced was less than the state pension age. So right from the beginning, and I know, Mervyn, you were talking about the longer term history, but for the last 120 years, age has been associated with death.
Absolutely.
And I think why do we not want to talk about getting old? It's because for so long, life expectancy and getting older have been inextricably linked. Now, that's absolutely not the case now, and our chronological age need not and does not in many cases have a direct bearing on our health or longevity. But that human instinct to associate the two is, I think, how do we address it? It's got to be linked in with that. Thinking about the way that people identify who an older person is, in my experience, it's almost always somebody 10 years older than what they are now. So as you get older, that does decrease. But my granny, 2 years before she died, was still knitting for the old people. She was in her 80s. My mother is going to move to where I live when she gets old. She's 87, has had cancer and a double heart bypass. So there's an absolute rejection of age as being a defining characteristic. So why don't people associate as old? Because they don't want to, because of the associations, and because they don't feel it. I don't know about you, Jamie, and when I look in the mirror each morning, especially in the mornings, I'm slightly shocked, because on the inside, I feel very much as I did at 27. But on the outside, I know there is an inevitable senescence that is occurring in my body. And I think the third thing I would say, the third thing I'll say, and I don't think it will be all, is that societally, and picking up on what my other panelists have said, we are absolutely youth obsessed. And it is almost seen as a shame to look old. We, as women, we are often shamed into dyeing our hair, whereas men are congratulated on having some. No, well done, Mervyn. Good. Nice head of hair there. And yet a few grey hairs and I'll be discriminated against. Mm-hmm. And so this societal anchoring around youth is desperately unhelpful. And as a society, we celebrate youth and we don't revere experience. Because with age, I think as Jackie said, it's the accumulation of changes over time. And I love that, because it's more than just experience. It's about the changes to your body, to all sorts of things. I think that's an absolute brilliant definition. I'm going to steal it with pride. So why? I'd say three things. Because age is associated with death. Because we live in a society that is discriminatory and deeply youth-centred. So if we can go on to the how, then how do we address those three things?
Do you think, Mary, that one of the issues that I've confronted as I've got older is that we use, even as older adults, youth and youthfulness as our benchmark. So we talk about being 70 years young.
Yeah.
We talk about issues around not looking our age. Or someone says to me, well, I'm lying now, but I'd like someone to say to me, Mervyn, you don't look 70. Because my retort to that would be, I'll next ask my grandson, who is 7, that he's looking good for the age of 7. So in a sense, I think what worries me is that this is not about them and us at one level. This is about how, as we age, we can often absorb the negativeness, we internalise that negativeness, we accept it, quote, as normal. So in one sense, I suppose what I'm asking for is that the consequences of what Jackie was saying and Mary, what you were highlighting, is that the ageing process and our sense of self is about the myths that surround us as we get older, which include almost everything: our body, our mind, our sense of self, our living context, and our endings and our loss. So it's not just one or two things. It's a whole, cohesive, coherent range of negativeness that we often internalise.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right in brief. So I'd reference two things. First of all, the the mass age discrimination when we think that age has the same status as a protected characteristic as disability, race, gender. And yet, just as you said, you look good for your age, or wow, you can do that at your age. If we replace the word age with colour or gender, it would be absolutely intolerable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think the other thing is that you raised a really good point about internalized ageism. So there's the extrinsic, very obvious greeting card industry type ageism, and then there's the narrative that we tell ourselves. And there's been some fascinating academic research that I expect you're both familiar with that looks at why we exclude ourselves from activities and from self-belief. It's a massive barrier.
Absolutely. I mean, just to add to that, really, as a woman, I have experienced, gender discrimination. As a Black woman, I have experienced racial discrimination. As a practitioner, working with older adults for over 36 years, I would personally say there's no comparison when it comes to ageism. Because we talk about racial discrimination openly. There are laws that protect me. There are people who will protect me. The system is geared to protect me. In terms of my gender, there are laws, there's legislation that will protect me. Yeah? Give me that safety net to have some recourse to it, although it still exists and people. But when it comes to ageism, institutionally, over the 36 years, that has not changed. Yeah. Ageist responses, ageist views, and I pick up on Mervyn's very, very pertinent and relevant and very descriptive term, compassionate ageism. Yeah, where people then at some point in your life determine you have had enough. You have breathed for long enough. And it is time you should stop breathing. Yeah. And the decisions that are made, you go into certain settings, and the very first thing that's mandated is a do not attempt resuscitation order. Yeah. There is no other form of discrimination that it is more entrenched, is more sustained, is more acceptable, in brackets, than ageism.
I
think someone needs, as a society, when we talk about people, why are people don't want to consider themselves as aging? I think that's the fundamental basis of it.
Can I just, Mervyn, I'll come back to you in a second.
No, sorry, Jamie. I didn't mean
not at all. Not at all. Just to inject something else into this conversation then, because some really important and interesting, powerful points coming out there. In the current times, I mentioned at the outset, we have a savage virus which is affecting people all around the world, and we know quite obviously now that it is affecting older generations more so than younger generations, not exclusively so, but it's generally older people who are suffering more. Has that helped at all in us focusing on the sort of vulnerability of older people, or is it hindered, or do you think it's no different?
I see Mary shaking her head, but I can't resist saying this. that firstly, I think COVID-19 has made things really stark, really very extreme. We talk about the over 70s in terms of chronological age, and we talk about cocooning them, and we talk and frame that in the sense of protection and safeguarding. So I, at 70, am going to be cocooned and be safeguarded and protected. But and alongside that narrative is the narrative of culling, and that's been said very publicly, that older people, it's okay to cull older people because of, the cost-benefit analysis in terms of, the cost of looking after them and keeping them alive and so on and so forth outweighs outweighs the cost of keeping a younger person alive. Do you see where I'm coming from here?
Mm-hmm.
The most worrying aspect of this, the most disturbing aspect, is that this is state sanctioned. The state is actually talking about this narrative in this way and reframing it. And I think that one of the issues that will come out of COVID eventually will be a very clear message. And my anxiety is we go back to normal. And that normal still remains ageist, discriminatory, othering, and commodifying.
Yeah, okay.
I'll sit back now and let you talk.
Well, Jackie, let me come back to you. I did also see you shaking your head in response to whether this would improve things in terms of our view of older people. You shook your head.
Yeah, I believe the situation pre-COVID, there were a lot of us who were, rallying against the system, talking, recognizing the positioning, recognizing the very little value that was placed both on older adults, and I keep saying older adults because I stay away from saying older people, because it's again, recognizing that they're adults and steering away from infantilizing adults. Yeah. So when we use the term vulnerable older adults, it assumes that all older adults are vulnerable. Not all older adults are vulnerable. They are not a vulnerable population. You can ask that of my friends who are calling me and telling me their parents will not listen to them about not going outside. Yeah, people are adults, they have choices. We will continue down that road as well. So I think COVID-19, for what it is, the horrible, horrible thing that it is, has brought the issue firmly into the public eye. People who did not even think about adults in long-term care settings are now hearing and seeing. And as I said recently, for over 36 years, I have been a practitioner. I have been a nurse educator. I have worked in innovation. I have been a link tutor. And I have never seen as much people die in the last 3 weeks over that period, over that 36 years. I have seen more people die. Yeah. And for me, I agree. I agree with the term culling. I agree. Because initially, when the whole issue came up in terms of preparation, the first point that it was noted, the first setting that was noted was the hospital setting. Even though we were aware that the long-term care setting, adult social care and care homes would have been our most vulnerable point. Yeah? That the people in those settings were exceptionally susceptible to this contagion. However, it was left to managers, it was left to the sector to implement their own preventative measures and protocols. And that varied hugely. It varied so hugely that I had to stop working in one care home that I had been working in for quite a long time on the basis of 9 individuals clearly exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19 and staff being told not to wear masks. To people who have very stringent, so that the response was very varied. And the numbers, we will never get an accurate measurement, because last weekend, 4 people died on my watch. Yeah? Okay. None of them had a diagnosis, confirmed, none of them had been tested, body taken away, buried, cremated. Yeah? So I fear, seriously, I believe as Mervyn does, that when all of this is over, people will forget. And I think we need moral leaders who must not forget. I think this is the time. If we don't make this change now, then when? And we need to make this change now for ourselves and our children coming after us. We need to question why a segment of the population based on a social construct and based on chronological aging, why our lives are less valuable than, it is no longer, it's no longer, acceptable to say, our Western culture values youth, and we are coerced and we are driven to maintain youthful appearances. It is no longer acceptable. That is no longer an excuse. We need to go beyond that, and we need to ask ourselves very deep questions and change this.
Yeah, no, really, really, really powerful points again. And, I agree with you. There's so much that, if nothing, very, very little good will come from what's happening at the moment. But if anything does, then hopefully it's a reframing of these conversations and a real rethink about how we talk about people in society and remove some of these barriers. And yeah, there'll be lots of lessons learned from this, undoubtedly.
At least for the lives that have been lost.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think we owe people that. We
absolutely.
owe our nation that.
But let me move us on slightly. So I'm keen to talk about, and I'll use a small example, which is, an individual example, which is my mother. My mother, call her what you like, she is 81 years of age. She's doing very well. She's very healthy, and she does talk about herself as being old, but usually in a comical way. And she's still living on her own and perfectly able, and so on and so forth. So, which is all great news. And she like you, Mervyn, has been told to stay at home for a period of time. What's been interesting, I think, as an experience for me, and a bit of a wake-up call for me in many ways, is that there's certain things that she can't do because I've probably never taken the time to teach her, such as online banking, which has proved a real hardship because I can't just go round to the house and talk her through it and get her signed up. We've been trying to do things over the phone. She has got an iPad. She's had that for a couple of years, and she's persevered and she uses it. So she's got Skype. I'm so glad that's the case. If she was still just using her old mobile phone, she wouldn't even be able to see people, her family and friends. So, but there's certain things I regret, and there's also things that I think there's technologies that she could use that would help her, but I don't think she's really that interested in. She doesn't need to have. It's more stress learning the technology than it's worth, and I know my mum well enough to say that with some confidence. The point, the interesting thing I find though is that, increasingly, the oldest people in our society didn't grow up with the newest, newest technology. And increasingly that will be true. So, when I get to 80, there'll probably be things that, unless I keep bang up to date with all the technologies, there's things I won't have grown up with. And there's things even my 2-year-old son, when he gets to 80, won't have, kept up with, if you like. And I wonder whether, if our solution to everything is it all goes online, it's all digital, it's all high tech, maybe that is the answer. Maybe that's the solution for all sorts of assisted living and friendship and all that sort of stuff. But can we keep sort of society up to date with technologies as we age at the ever-increasing pace that technology is changing? I just wonder, and I think of it in the context of when I worked for a company. We were doing retirement planning, and we were saying, well, we want to do everything online. And of course, we want to do everything online, but do our older customers want to do that, or do they want to speak to someone? Just, Mary, I maybe come to you, interested in your thoughts on how we deal with people and the role of technology and so on.
So first of all, I'm contentiously going to disagree with you, Jamie.
Okay. Please do.
I think that talking about can older people, do they want to do this or that, is like saying, it is saying to 50% of the population want to do this or that, because people over 50 are no more homogeneous group than all women like doing this or that. Pink razors don't really do it for me. So I would say let's not, and to talk from the experience of one, your mother doesn't. Equally, my mother ordered a new laptop because she had just got a new robotic vacuum cleaner and she wanted to be able to program it so that the rooms were done in the order she wanted. So different people, different choices. But but yes, you're right. You're right that there are things that technology can enable. But I think going back to another of your points around loneliness, I was looking at some stats before coming on here today, and at the moment, recent study, 10% of young adults say they're lonely often or very often. Only 3% of 65-year-olds identify as the same thing. So we think about loneliness increasing with age, and certainly there are some people for whom that's very true. But actually, there are intergenerational issues that arise. And the same, going back to coronavirus, the blanket shutdown of people over the age of 70 is absolutely reinforcing that chronological view of age. So again, a couple of stats, because we can't avoid them in financial services. 50% of people in their early 60s will have at least one underlying symptom that puts them at more risk. And 20% of those early 60s have at least two indicators that put them at more risk of coronavirus. Of the people in their 70s, there are 30% who have none. So on none of the statistical reasons is 70 a justifiable reason to shut down an entire cohort. And I think as the other participants have said, it just reinforces that absolutely invidious ageism that we've got in our society. So I don't think I answered your question at all then, but I said what I wanted to.
No, absolutely, and that's the joy of this. And I probably said too much. And you're right. You're right. I mean, maybe even you're right. Even in my introduction, I'm perhaps guilty of generalising on the basis of a study of one person, my mother, which we're all guilty of doing. But it's a good example of how we can do that. Jackie, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, I was going to say that in terms of technology, going back to the fundamental question you raised, technology and that older adults are seeing as being technophobic and it's very difficult. You hear people in industry focusing on they want to design a product or commercialize a product, and they have to teach people how to use. I think the fact of the matter is, technology has always been with us. Yeah, in every decade, every century, we have seen a historical progression. We call it technology now. At one point, it was industrialization, it was or some form of development, but it has always been a way, some inventions that have changed the way we live. And I think the use of current technology and emerging technologies now has so much more to do, so much more to underpin it than age. Yeah, it's all about people's educational level of attainment and how they see, these sorts of emerging technologies coming out. It's about their socioeconomic status, how equitable and how accessible some of these new and emerging technologies are. It's all about their personal preference. How important is self-esteem and social status to them. It's all about the design of some of these technologies, and the relevance of it to people. So there's so many other factors. I know, and I really support the view of age-neutral approaches to designing and facilitating, creating solutions for people. And the reason I say that, it's because a lot of the issues that people focus on when it comes to older adults or later life, it seems to be as though it's a default mode. You reach a certain age and you're expected to develop this condition. Yeah. One of the things I like to flag up is about incontinence. It's seen as an older adult, a later life issue. It is not. Yeah, statistically, between 12 to 69% of middle-aged women experience urinary incontinence. And the incidence for women in pregnancy is over 12%, new cases of urinary incontinence. So it's not an old woman's or old man's issue. Yeah. The whole issue around falls, you know, it's seen as an older person. Granted, the subsequent implications for a fall and the results of a fall are far more significant in terms of morbidity and mortality. But it is not a problem associated only with older adults. A significant number of young men fall off motorbikes, fall off ladders in the construction industry, sustain head injuries. Yeah? The solutions, it's not about somebody's age, it is about the problem. And I always say to people, you know, people I work with, don't sell your product. Sell the problem you solve. When you recognize and you do the research, you underpin it with the research, it gives you a clearer perspective rather than a pinhole visioned one. Yeah? And sell self-esteem, sell empowerment, sell freedom, yeah, sell choice, sell desirability and attractiveness, but most of all, sell the problem you solve, sell the solution to the problem that you're solving. Yeah, and I think that's important. I think we really, and I know it is difficult because, you know, in the past 10 years, in my experience, you know, working in innovation, I have gone on at length to people, you know, you don't see, what you see is not the reality of the person. You see my gray hair, you see my wrinkles, you see me and you automatically refer to me as elderly. And I think this is a term that should be taken out. You know, it should be seen as not PC, because the so-called elderly people do not consider themselves elderly. There's no definition for the word elderly, and it is hugely misleading in terms of people's perceptions. How you perceive of something is how you talk about it. You develop attitudes about it. It influences your mindset, your language about it. It influences how you develop solutions for instance, how you see your market, you know, your market or the people that you're creating these solutions for. So it's important that, you know, age-neutral approaches are a way of supporting us in moving this agenda forward and being more successful.
That's really interesting, Jackie. And you there was a point there you made which struck a chord, and you'll all be familiar with this. We've even created language when it comes to falls that differentiate by age. So we talk about young people fall, old people have a fall.
Yes.
Like we've actually differentiated
Absolutely.
the language, and you know who people are talking about by the way that it's worded.
Yeah.
Mervyn, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, you can never follow Jackie. That's the challenge.
Oh, you stop it.
Sharing a platform with such a whirlwind. So, I mean, a couple of things, actually, Jamie. One, to pick up with Mary. And Mary was absolutely right. Both, to pick you up on the issue of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But secondly, the issue of loneliness. Because loneliness has become, in and of itself, a total multi-million-pound industry.
Yeah.
And it's based on a myth. It's based on a manipulation. And the fact that Mary quite rightly was saying that if you look at the stats and you look at the research, the older adults, you know, who might feel lonely, are far less than other, if you like, demographics and whatever. I think the other issue that Mary touched upon, which triggered in my head, was we never talk about social class when it comes to issues around growing older and aging. And it seems to me that a lot of advertising, a lot of the narrative around technology, around a whole range of stuff, is actually presented by middle class people in the industry, whether it be marketing or commerce or flogging financial services. So an older generation, which they have turned into somebody else with assumptions about what they want and what they don't want. And I think that that's something that I think Jackie's absolutely right, that we need to be thinking about age neutral. And there's the old saying that if it's good and it works for an older adult. It works for everybody. And I think that's pretty true. I would like to see class being given more of an airing in relation to deliberation and dialogue when it comes to exclusion. And that's all I really needed to say.
Okay, very interesting. We had another point that I'm keen just to touch on around something that I'm probably less familiar with, around the fact that we deal quite often with the family, or indeed the carer, whether that's a formal and external to the family or within the family. We deal with a third party in relation to somebody who is older and potentially vulnerable, i.e. they are actually a vulnerable person for various different reasons. Is that something anybody can comment on? How do we keep the agency, if you like, of the individual concerned when we're dealing through third parties, doctors, nurses, carers, family? Anybody want to come in on that?
You're all rushing to the mic.
Hands up. I think the system is set up. We wanted to give the person the agency, the power of self-determination, the family or the carer, the power of self-determination. I think we have to look at the system. The system is set up to take that away, fundamentally. Yeah. And I think it's more about how. I know that there are existing policies, there are existing frameworks that are set up to try to maintain an individual's level of choice within certain settings, their decision-making ability. In my experience, often it is the family that begins to take that away from the individual. It's much closer to home than an external provider or organization or system. Yeah. And I have seen been in many multidisciplinary team conversations, many meetings with families and individuals, and sons and daughters disempower their parents. It's almost as though they become, even though the parent is cognitively able, compass mentis, to make these decisions, by virtue of their age and frailty, physical frailty, they are seen as not being able to make a decision or not being able to express a choice or an opinion. And I find that very, very sad. And I think, I always go back to the turning point in my career, which was being sat in a multidisciplinary team meeting with a consultant son, daughter, the individual, an occupational therapist and a physiotherapist, and a gentleman had had 3 falls at home. And on this basis, he was deemed to be unsafe at home. And the discussion was around putting him into a care home because it would have deemed safer, and he would be able to have monitoring and round the clock be safer. Yeah. And the gentleman was not allowed any say. And I've seen this so many times. And he turned to me and he said to me, "Sister, please don't let them put me into a care home. If you do, you will be sentencing me to a life of celibacy." That was the turning point in my career. Mm-hmm. That is what this means to this man. And so the system itself is an agent that takes away people's ability, when they have it. But more importantly, families, sons and daughters, and I think that's where it starts, must recognize that their parents, we have the saying, once a man, twice a child. All of those sorts of phrases consolidate the fact that in advanced years, you are in child mode. So your children now need to make the decisions for you. And children, as often people would like to think, love and family and caring, it is not always the case. And that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and of course, absolutely. And of course, long-term care and social care still lacks a coherent policy, and that's not helping either, because it takes the focus off the individual in many cases. It becomes more of a financial matter, from what I can see, which is a shame, because no matter what the outcome, it's not the right, it shouldn't be the right starting point. It's how much will things cost and where does the inheritance go. It should be about what's the right thing to do for the individual, and indeed what does the individual want to do.
Yeah, there's a huge chasm between policy making, decision making, strategy, and the reality of what happens on the ground in real life, the dynamics of family life. And I would say that the problem originates again with our perception, individuals' perception of old age, the meanings and they ascribe to that. And one of those meanings is that as you grow older, and if you become physically frail, you must be mentally frail. And that is not the case. And it's the family in which I find this lack of power is continuously eroded.
Mary, sorry, you want to come in?
Jamie, can I come in there?
Absolutely.
So I'm absolutely not as much of an expert in the social care or medical arena as Jackie and Mervyn are. So I was just going to bring it down the line a bit further into people as they get older, and some of the ways that we as businesses haven't kept up. Because I think this is something we absolutely can do something about. And obviously we should address the holistic social care piece as well. So if we take our industry, Jamie, power of attorneys are massively underused. So people are not putting in place the things to be able to say to the people who they choose, this is who I want to make decisions, and then how they want those decisions to be made. And I really think we need the digital power of attorney is a good step forward, but our systems within financial institutions aren't keeping up with that. So it's very difficult for all points of an organisation to be able to immediately see a power of attorney. And I think that leads me to a wider point, which is back to age being a fear of death, both families and individuals holding back from having a conversation about what they want the difficult points in their life to be. So at what point do you want to go into a care home? How do you want to die? What do you want this to look like? And you'll know just a specific point about equity release, which is a product that is quite contentious, but most of the complaints I have seen about the product have been from the children where they weren't even aware that their parents had taken out a product because the parents didn't feel able to tell their children about it. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's about so many things about communication, right? So much there. But another way that I don't think business has kept up is by thinking about carers. So arguably, you are more likely to be in work and be caring for somebody than you are to be in work and have a young baby. So we have provision in place for people to take time off if a child gets sick at nursery, etc., etc. Not many companies have provision for somebody to take time off if a dependent needs them. And I had an absolutely revolting example last year where we did have a carers policy, and somebody came to me and said, Mary, my manager told me it wasn't an emergency. My father's locked himself out of the house and he's got dementia. My manager says I have to wait to the end of my shift. And so businesses need to wake up to this, because to Jackie's point, if you are defined by your occupation as a carer, then you want to take your own agency. Actually, if carers are allowed to work, to live, and also to support, I think we'll get more balance and more honesty about how many people are carers.
It's a really, really good point, and you're quite right. And it's a it's not an age-defined issue, really, being a carer. It can affect people at all stages of life. And indeed, I mean, nor is parenthood quite the age-defined issue that it once was. I'm testament to that, being a father of a 2-year-old at almost 50. But no, indeed, absolutely. And I think you're right. When I think back, you struck a chord there, because I think back about all the communications that I see from other employers to their employees, and it's very much centred around, the young family and women returning to work, and rightly so. Those issues really important, but almost at the absolute exclusion of carers. We put that as a bit of an add-on to these types of communications. I'd like to start drawing us to a close, but I'll give each of you another opportunity to say a few words, if that's okay. And base it around this, if you will, or just some final comments. I'll come to you, Jackie, first, if that's okay. But the final point we had on our agenda, if you like, was thinking about how we stimulate positive conversation around people aging. So not the aged society or older people, but people aging and that process, however you want to define it. How can we have a more positive conversation? And indeed, Jackie, add any final comments you'd like to make in the next couple of minutes.
Okay. And one comment I'd like to make on the back of the last discussion there, I think we need to lift the cover of adult social care. We need to lift the cover of the whole discussion around the social construct of old age in this country, and what it means and how we respond to it. Yeah. Death is something that people have feared from time immemorial. But we live in an age with huge social changes, huge technological progress, far more understanding, literacy levels, and education. And I think we have the resources to address dignified, peaceful, comfortable death. Yeah. The second thing is, I believe that in supporting us, I think the mainstream media has a role to play, has a huge role to play. And in my experience with a few media companies, I will not say generalize, but the few media companies that I have been in contact with, they are not interested in aging. They're interested in scandals. Yeah. I approached somebody to have a conversation, to raise this, and I was told, Jackie, that won't get past my editorial board. Bring me a scandal. My response was, I am not about naming and shaming. I am about change. The third thing and final point I'd like to make is with regard to positive discussions. I think charity begins at home. I think within ourselves, within companies, within organizations, leadership, thought leaders, I think we need to start challenging ourselves as to how we really think about this. And people have always said to me, it's just words. What do you call, it's just semantics. And I have two quotes here, one from Rudyard Kipling. Words, of course, are the most powerful drug used by mankind. And the second one by T.S. Eliot is that for last year's words belong to last year's language, and next year's words await another voice. And I would like that voice to begin with us, because it is our future that we are talking about here and our lifestyle in years to come.
Jackie, thank you very much. Mervyn, I'll give you the pleasure of following that again.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamie, but I'm not going to let Jackie have one over on me. I'm going to quote Charles Dickens. And Charles Dickens, Charles Dickens wrote, "Charity begins at home, but justice begins next door." And I thought that was very interesting, because when I was initially looking at issues around elder abuse and the abuse of older adults in their families many years ago, what I used to say is that we get so busy looking at what's going on next door, we fail to look at what's going on in our own homes. And so in that sense, I think that I'm arguing that how we think about our parents, how we think about our aging relatives, how we think about older people in general, has far more influence, both in terms of being a family, providing a service, or producing products for people to buy. The key issue is, how do I think about the older customer? What's my mindset? And I have to say that to improve things, taking your original point, how do we make it better? And that is to look within ourselves, how we regard both our own ageing, and to ensure that everyone has the right to their own agency. And I'll finish on this, and then I will really finish. I've often said that if you're 80 and you run a forum and you're very active, what you say is not necessarily right. Being 7 years old does not necessarily make you wrong. And so what I would argue is that being honest, coming together and respecting the 7-year-old as well as the 70-year-old, but not because of their age, but because they're human.
Thank you very much. Mary.
Gosh, finishing there, right. So the question is, how can we stimulate positive conversations about age? So I've got 3 things that I would put up for discussion and consideration in a wider group and with this wider audience. The first one is that I think ageism needs to be called out, it needs to be prosecuted, and it needs to be unacceptable. And that is discrimination against young people. You know, the young blonde woman will be discriminated against in very different ways, but equally to the older black woman. We know that age exacerbates discrimination. So it's not acceptable. Let's call it out. Let's see some prosecutions around it. The second thing is a slightly more positive, which is that I think intergenerational discussions and intergenerational solutions need to be found. So what I just Googled before this event, I Googled intergenerational. The first thing after the dictionary and wiki definitions was intergenerational conflict. That's shocking that Google thinks the most important thing intergenerationally is conflict. So some of the challenges that you experience in different ages, we need to start to solve together. And I think the government looking at an intergenerational approach rather than dividing older and younger on a binary definition is maybe unhelpful. So what can we look at that unites us, and how can we help the 5 generations that are in the workforce now working together, work together better? And the third thing that I would then wrap all those other things around with would be a national campaign to talk about some of these things and to lift it up into the open. But that can only happen, I think, when those 2 other fundamentals have been addressed and then put in place to find some positives. And because my co-panelists have put me on the spot to end with a line, I would say that if you discriminate on age, the thing you're discriminating against is your future self. So if you value yourself, don't discriminate on age.
Thank you very much. Well, you've all given me really good closes and indeed final points and quotes, which is wonderful. So thank you. I'll finish with a brief anecdote from me. As I mentioned, I have a 2-year-old son. When he was 1, I remember being in a coffee shop, and the woman who served me behind the counter said, quite innocently, said, you know, is that your grandson? And I wasn't offended, I was amused by, and I was trying to think, how do I respond in a way that I don't offend her? I don't want her to be offended by the fact she's made the mistake. And I just said, that's actually I know I'm very old, but it's actually my son. And she didn't say anything, and I realised she was a little bit embarrassed about it, despite my best efforts. Anyway, she served me the coffee. When she came over to the table and served my coffee in a little baby chino, as it was for my son, she said to me, "I just said that because you were so attentive with him when you came in, and only grandparents do that. Parents are usually just on their phones and don't really bother." And I thought that was one of the best recoveries I've ever heard.
Nice one. Nice one.
They're probably true. Anyway, I'll finish there. Thank you very much, Jackie, Mervyn, Mary. That's been absolutely fascinating, very insightful, powerful, and even moving at times. So really very much appreciated.